The official Chivalry Medieval Warfare servers shut down in April 2024. Mordhau had its golden age before it descended into a place where role-playing as a French dwarf became a viable strategy to survive as a new player.
What have I done to deserve this from you, huh?
Mirage Arcane Warfare took its name to heart, and now Chivalry 2 stands atop Regicide as its last major update, with No More Room in Hell 2 looking like a good excuse to make Chivalry the third. PvP melee slashers, games that mysteriously break your monitor because you got 360 pan scoped. The multiplayer FPS space for the longest of time has primarily been about first-person shooters, glorified archery, but what about first-person swords? Well, Chivalry Medieval Warfare was the answer that I and many others found to that question all the way back in 2012. With barely a dent of experience compared to the legends of that time, many fond memories, funny moments, and, to be honest, salt came from this game. Originally, this video was going to be a nostalgia piece just for this, but then I started to notice some annoyingly similar issues in Mordhau that could have been avoided. Then I began to recognize old habits that re-emerged and burnt those who stayed loyal to Chivalry 2. Habits that have the potential to pass over to a completely different game that is the manifestation of I kid you not, near 14-year prophecy. These aren't necessarily terrible games, and each one has a special place in my heart, but I can't help but notice that the ball was dropped quite consistently. And with a new wave of games coming to this genre, I feel like it's worth doing a retrospective. This isn't just what went wrong with Medieval Warfare. This is what went wrong with PvP melee slashers. And I'm WickedWiz, being a man of my word, standing here, about to get wrecked. This is the rough timeline of releases and relevant games involved in this retrospective. About 20 years, and each game has their own history that spans many rabbit holes. Some that go quite deep. Just to give you an idea, one guy made a 4-hour-long video essay covering mostly community drama and issues within Chivalry 2. Someone else made an hour's worth analysis on Mirage Arcane Warfare. Both great videos that deserve way more views. So I'm going to set the bar here as more of an overview, a bit of a starting point, but even with that as a scope, there's a lot to go through. If I were to hypothetically, theoretically destabilize the economy in Oblivion with an Oblivion sword, one could call that a bit of a hack and slash situation, but there's not that much to it besides just swinging your weapon in a repetitive loop while holding block every now and then. With games like this, the weapon model itself doesn't really define when or where the damage is applied. Just aim, play animation in the general direction of enemy, and win. Warband is a notable step away from this with its directional combat system, where manipulating the journey of your attack and defense matters. It's a melee slasher, but generally speaking, most games back in the day with a focus on melee weren't so much geared towards directional combat. And while it's not a requirement for a melee game to be fun, the need for something more immersive was very much there. And that's where Chivalry Medieval Warfare is different, because weapons have real-time tracing. What that means is that any given blade or bonk has a lethal point of contact and an active hitbox approximating the model's dimensions that trace a line during the attack animation. Basically, the path of your weapon counts and the path ends when it makes contact with any given body part. Damage is then applied, and if well placed, you get a nice slice. Additionally, as a multiplayer experience, the player rig is the same in first and third person, so what you see in first person is pretty much what everyone else sees. Because damage is only applied when the weapon makes contact, manipulation of the weapon's journey can add a whole new level to combat. Turn in to accelerate an attack. Turn away to drag it out and delay. Then die by archer. It's Chivalry Medieval Warfare that pioneered this simple but effective combat system. In this game specifically, there are only 3 attacks: swing, stab, and overhead. Well, actually 4 if you include kicks that can disrupt the enemy, but pair that in with temporarily held parries and the ability to feint to cancel your attacks. Then you have what is known as psychological warfare, or just a combat system within a multiplayer setting that has a large skill curve. Brutally punishing, yet satisfyingly rewarding. There have always been medieval fantasy style games out there, each with their own unique selling point, but it's hard to express just how special this one was. It had the grit of the era it was trying to emulate, it had a serious tone to it, and in contrast, a natural slapstick comedy that was hard to rival. But this game isn't where the story truly began. No, because like all good things in life, this was just the evolution of a Half-Life 2 mod known as Age of Chivalry. About 20 years ago in 2005, not too long after the release of Half-Life 2, a game I'm not going to spend 15 minutes explaining, Age of Chivalry began its development. It was pioneered by co-founders Rikard Lindgren, Jeff Simmons, and Scott Chipman. In a nutshell, it provided a similar answer to what Medieval Warfare did later, but of course with heightened limitations. For a 2000s medieval-themed PvP mod, it's really impressive. There are a bunch of unique maps to explore, each with their own objectives to keep fights focused. I mean, with this being a mod, if you wanted to, you can just fight in Helm's Deep. There are also multiple classes to master, each with their own unique flair, and looking at it, it's hard not to forget that this is a mod. Interestingly enough, the concept of dragging your weapon to hit multiple targets or manipulate attacks was also a thing back then. Although due to a lack of any dedicated animators at the time, animations were placeholder, and additionally, the trace lines were manually drawn rather than generated during the animation. But either way, they clearly found a gap in the market, as they achieved over 3,000 players within the first few days, and although they didn't really see any real peak till much later, it was clear that people wanted something like this. There's this interesting post titled 32 Maps Released and a Reflection on Age of Chivalry, published in November of 2010 by Tiberius Bain, aka Steve Piggott, who later became the lead game designer at Torn Banner Studios. It's a long but interesting read about what went right, what went wrong, and the lessons learned before making their own standalone game, with also a bit of unfortunate foreshadowing. If all else fails, you could just add zombies, as that technique seems equally effective, is a comment I didn't expect to echo through time. But to get to the point, the TLDR of this retrospective is that they learned from the struggles of making patches post-launch, wishing that they did more pre-launch in testing to basically avoid flames in the forum. They learned that the new player experience is crucial to get right to sustain growth. As cool as this mod was, it wasn't that easy to get into, because by extension, another lesson learned is that players can get good at your game and will naturally create their own meta. One thing all developers will discover is that you don't truly know how broken your game is till someone starts playing it. Something they knew well, that will remain a consistent design philosophy, is the idea of including features that add value to the experience without impact on the actual gameplay. Candy is what they call it, and jibs is basically what they're talking about. It's the little stuff in a game that gets people talking. This was a well-respected retrospective, and something honestly rare to see in this day and age when it comes to developers owning up to their own mistakes. And it won't be their last either. Chivalry Battle for Agatha was announced in May 2010 as a standalone game carrying on from Age of Chivalry. The project was later renamed to Chivalry Medieval Warfare, along with a rebrand of the company from Team Chivalry to Torn Banner Studios in February 2011. Working on Unreal Engine 3 naturally freed it from the limitations that came with modding. As already seen, the real-time tracing combat system was a unique selling point that drew many people in, as if the overall concept wasn't enough. This time there are only 4 classes to choose from to keep things simple: the Knight, Vanguard, Man-at-Arms, and Archer. Each class has their own inherent perks and weaknesses, like for example the Knight is quite slow but very tanky, the Vanguard is a bit faster and usually uses longer weapons, the Man-at-Arms is a bit more close range and fast, and the Archer be arching. With each class, there are a whole bunch of different weapons to unlock, and this time there are larger maps for larger battles, along with siege equipment like the Ballista and what I like to call the Send Me Home Catapult. Movement was also fine-tuned to a better standard that complemented the more optimized and immersive combat system. Before release, they set up a Kickstarter in order to get some funding for the project, with the goal to reach over 50k, of which they surpassed, sitting at about 86, close enough to their stretch goal of customizable emblems, that they definitely had more than enough money to implement later on. I remember missing out on the Kickstarter, and $25 for a copy or $50 for beta access included felt fair enough for what was promised. Either way, upon release, this was a sight to behold, and this is where the rise truly began before the fall. As someone who was around at the time it was released, I can thoroughly confirm that this was the right game for me. Cool, nice to know. Why does that even matter? Well, as much of a draw as the combat system was, the overall concept is easily recognizable and easy to sell. Big medieval battles in a PvP game. Call of Duty but with swords is what I would say to friends when describing it. At a glance, it's instantly recognizable as to what it is and what kind of fun it could offer. If the trailers weren't enough to get people hyped or curious enough to give it a go, then gameplay, montages, and funny moments might just be. Age of Chivalry may have been the first introduction for quite a few, but to most, medieval warfare was their first. For the people who were sold on the idea, charging into combat, getting hit, and occasionally poking back was enough to keep you going, regardless of failure. Yeah, so what if your KD sucks? You still remember the odd win here and there. You remember getting revenge on your first archer and making some kind of progress. It was frustrating in its own right, but hooked many people in. The hours would fly by, you'd level up and unlock new weapons with each class and get better over time. And hey, look at that, you're now level 16. The game on its own is very simple, but with how much freedom there is, the skill curve can quickly make a difference between the more casual and the more committed players. Without any kind of skill-based matchmaking, that difference can be felt even more so. And it's the solution to preempt this problem that unironically became the problem. As a new player, you could join these low-rank beginner servers, where only those under rank 15 could join. And if you thought people wouldn't buy an extra copy of the game just to smurf those servers, you'd be wrong in thinking so. Now, there were a couple key issues that came with these servers that ultimately contributed to the rapid rise and fall of the player count. First is how it split the player base. When you've got new players sheltered within official beginner servers and pros waiting on the other side for people to get past rank 15, not only does the player base split, but also expectations. To be clear, new players could go into any unlocked server. It's just that most would rightfully start in beginner servers, as it seemed like a good place to start and get to grips with the game. But that brings us to the next point, because it wasn't. Just like any game, the longer it exists, the higher the average playtime gets for those who stick around. So of course, the longer it exists, the shock of going from low rank to any rank only gets worse. If you need some kind of visual evidence, this is the level 20 achievement. You know something ain't right when it's glowing at 4.5%. Clearly, reaching level 16 and getting locked out of these servers caught many people off guard. And it's mainly because of the expectations that were set during the beginner server experience. New players wouldn't often encounter pro players who've developed a greater understanding over the combat system and its exploits. Fighting high-skilled players was like being an extra in a scene against the main character. If that main character had insane core strength or just no respect for their spine. Now there's refined technique and depth to combat that the tutorial could never prepare you for. As an additional point for the low rank servers, they were typically better populated, especially after a sale compared to others. So to be honest, I don't really blame those who made the odd Smurf account. I would have too if I had the money, because I remember very well that sometimes it felt like you were locked off from most of the player base. The combat system was amazing for what freedom it provided, but that freedom, the freedom to manipulate the journey of your weapon for when or where damage can be applied, naturally brought a lot of complexity to a game with a combat system that, let's just say, wasn't perfectly made. Readability is everything. If I see you swing, then I parry, but I can only hold a parry for a short period of time. So your goal is to simply hit me when I'm not parrying, and one way to do that is to get me to parry too early. A simple way of doing this is to feint an attack and follow up with another. Things, however, get a bit more complicated when you start delaying or accelerating attacks to make someone parry at the wrong time or in the wrong place. You see, the goal was always to trick the opponent, but it was the freedom to manipulate attacks that allowed advanced and difficult to read techniques to develop. While a simple drag looks fair enough, people get used to it, and it becomes less effective to more experienced players. Then of course, things evolve, metas form, and new or casual players find themselves at the mercy of a combat system that was already kinda rough, but now thoroughly exploited. In a fairly short period of time, this game became less of a casual experience and turned into one that required more from you to compete. So it's no surprise that it struggled to thrive. And this is a common thread we'll see again. What annoyed people the most is that Torn Banner didn't seem to do much to improve things. Of course they did fix things and patch certain stuff, but they basically let the exploits become features. Features that only exacerbated the issue. To be fair, the foundations were probably a bit too shaky to patch stuff without potentially changing the entire thing. Sometimes a complete rework is needed. However, with that being said, exploits like the reverse overhead or the rainbow drag, which is a very classic example, could have at least been tackled in some way. It's a move where you turn your back to the opponent during the windup of an overhead to apply near instant damage on release. Although it was admittedly a satisfying thing to pull off, it wasn't favoured by many and only confused or broke immersion for new players. The lack of communication that came with this, or the inaction to remedy key issues that were clearly contributing to the downfall of the game, ultimately began to create resentment towards Stormbanner. About 10 months after release, Stormbanner had something special to announce. The Deadliest Warrior DLC, where knights, Vikings, samurai, ninjas, Spartans, and pirates fight to the end. This was a really cool collaboration project with Spike TV's Deadliest Warrior series. If you've not seen the show, then you've definitely seen this clip. It was a show that blessed us all with what if Genghis Khan faced Hannibal, or if a Viking fought a samurai, or even just Mafia versus Yakuza. The fact that they took on the IP to make a DLC where notable warriors from different time periods and settings go head to head was genuinely awesome. Unfortunately though, it wasn't that well received. There was a different pace to combat, the knight class didn't feel anything like the base game, and balancing was a bit of a miss. But many people, like myself, loved it for what it was. A fun vacation from the main game. It wasn't the most original concept. Pirates, Vikings, and knights has been around for a while, and it's not the first time where Spike TV worked with developers to make a game using their IP. It also didn't take off as anything more successful than Medieval Warfare, but definitely tested the waters for where things could go, if things would go anywhere at all, which they didn't. As fun as it was to be ninja and miss a shot as a pirate knowing full well you didn't have enough time to reload before ye shivers get timbered, this DLC split an already shrinking community. It was basically its own separate game with its own separate servers. But the sad part about it is that Stormbanner realized this, made a choice to stick with Medieval Warfare, and never properly communicated when support for Deadliest Warrior would end. It wasn't a standalone either, you had to own Medieval Warfare to even play it, so the barrier to entry on a financial level was also a drawback. Even today, with nobody online, they could drop the game, but never the price. This was a very successful game, and they made a lot of sales, but in the process, something quite important was lost. The decline can be illustrated in one image. The Chivalry crossover with Dying Light, posted on the 6th of December 2019, well after its unofficial death. The irony that their last crossover was with a title quite literally called Dying Light is insane to say the least, but there are multiple layers to what went wrong between release and this unfortunate crossover. The surface level issues at a glance come down to two primary things: the lack of original content and cosmetics over concern. While they did add their own content, one complaint is that it wasn't in great supply. Everyone has their favorite map, but over time, even that gets old. And looking back, one could argue that it was the community that carried the way when it came to additional content. As with the release of their SDK, those with the passion and skill to make mods provided for some really cool content. I mean, I'll never forget the first time I joined a Star Wars server. That was insane. Probably some of the most fun I've had in a game since. One thing that became very apparent was the talent within the modding space, so it was no surprise that Stormbanner decided to host a competition for more content. The Fortification Team Objective Map Contest. This was a partnering between Stormbanner, Steam, Nvidia, Logitech, and Foreshadowing to bring talent together to design and create new maps that could later be added to the game, with of course the chance to win prize money as well as some additional products. In the end, it provided us players with 5 cool new maps, and I remember this event in particular bringing a lot of people back at the time. It was really nice to not only have a new set of environments to play in, but also nice to know that this was community-made content. To play devil's advocate, working hard to create core content with no guarantee that you'll be paid or compensated did seem a bit cheap. You're basically getting a whole bunch of free concepts to pick and choose from rather than going through the typical process. But without trying to bring it down too much, it did seem to go well. The point here, however, is that not much else was coming from in-house development. Even the store was mostly community driven, and this was a sign that the foot was off the pedal. You've already seen one of the crossovers, but crossovers did become their own sort of comedy and revealed the frustration many people had for where this game was going. Chivalry had its fair share of cosmetics, from seasonal to things you can earn and things you can buy. But it wasn't until the 1st of May 2015 when they started doing crossover content. The first was with Depth, a unique indie game of its time where you team up with other divers against a shark while trying to loot some treasure. It's a well-respected game that has a really cool concept. The crossover was also quite sensible and well received. In Chivalry, you'd get a shark-themed helmet and a weapon skin, and in Depth, you'd get a couple medieval skins too. What I quite liked about this one is that for Depth, they replicated the hilltop map, but put it underwater. Seems like a win-win all round. Both games are pretty cool, can share an audience, and players get something in return. A bit later in August, the Killing Floor 2 crossover was announced, then released in September, where if you owned both games, you would get some fleshy zombified weapons in Chivalry and a knight character in Killing Floor 2. But what I think confused most people was the Rocket League crossover. This one was only announced 6 days after the Killing Floor 2 announcement, and thankfully it was just emblems. But already people could see what was going on. Torn Banner caught the flu of cross-promotion madness. Already there were core issues not being addressed, and it started to look like they were grabbing the bag before dipping out. I mean, the cherry on top for some was the Payday 2 crossover that was announced only 2 days after the Killing Floor 2 crossover. I'm not gonna lie, it wasn't much of a surprise with how much stuff was added to that game, and I'll be honest, the night class in Payday 2 was fun to play, but by this point, an already sour taste started to become bitter. But if that feeling wasn't too great for PC, then let's take a moment to think about the console players. It was ported to 4 consoles in total across 2 generations in the following release order. And in summary, it was still a fun game, just a bad port. Whatever flaws and jank were on PC also came to console. There was also no crossplay, so of course standards over time split between platforms. And overall, the experience was significantly less enjoyable by comparison. Due to tech limitations, matches were smaller scale, capping at 24 players as opposed to PC with 40 to 60. The large-scale maps built for greater numbers on PC made online matches on console feel more hollow. But the thing that seemed to ruin it for most people were the server issues. If you weren't hosting the match, lag and connectivity would be your main enemy. It's insane to look back at old reviews and see this in action. I think what sucked the most is that those on console, just like on PC, saw great potential, but due to Torn Banner's growing inactivity, never saw much hope for a future. Communication in general wasn't too great, and reassurance for if there would ever be anything like this again just wasn't really there. When it comes to the heart of it, the lack of communication, the lack of polish, and a failure to act upon what was driving players away ultimately accelerated the decline. Of course, there's the natural aging process, but things could have been better, and they know that. Typically, this part of the video is finding evidence to back a point, but not much is needed when they admit to their own failings. Similar to Age of Chivalry, Steve Piggott made a post reflecting on what went right and what went wrong. What went right in a nutshell was the game itself and the unique experience it provided. Nobody can say it's a terrible game or a perfect one either. There was just nothing else like it at the time. This was genuinely a great game, and the frustration came from a place of seeing what you love turn to dust without a promise of any future. And in their retrospective, they admit to the issues that caused this feeling. Poor communication. They struggled to navigate the relationship with the community, failed to communicate the rationale behind changes, and went for long stretches without a sound. There was this fear of starting drama, seen before in Age of Chivalry, and arguably to a larger scale here. To be fair, it's not like they didn't try to interact and create a healthy relationship. It's just that the avoidance on certain issues caused resentment either way. They knew that they could have done better to explain the combat system in more depth within the onboarding process, and admitted that the low-ranked servers were a band-aid solution. They underestimated the issues that came with being able to drag your weapon, and the formation of exploits that came from this was admitted to be something that they should have fixed. When you look at it, you can see that this game was another step in unknown territory. This subgenre was new, and so were the unique challenges that came with it. Challenges that could have been better addressed. By 2015, it was already showing its age, and real change would likely require a complete rework. When that becomes the question, the solution is usually something new. They were working on something during 2015, but unfortunately by this point the damage was already done. And even after admitting to their mistakes, praise was now given to their new competitor. 2015 was a turning point for the PvP melee slasher scene. Mordhau wasn't yet a thing, but its predecessor, quite simply known as Project Slasher, was. And was also in the process of early development. Everyone by this point basically wanted a Chivalry 2, but unfortunately that wasn't in Torn Banner's best interest at the time, because before Project Slasher could become anything more than a test level, a massive flop was in the process. This is Mirage Arcane Warfare, and it was the self-proclaimed spiritual successor to Chivalry. Immediately you can see the contrast in aesthetics. From a dark, gritty medieval world to a magical Arabian Nights Persian-themed wonderland. It's a genuinely beautiful art style with the purpose to improve readability for what is essentially Chivalry, but also magic. Development likely started soon after Chivalry's release, and although it's not easy to pin down exactly when, the crossovers make a bit more sense now. The melee slasher combat system was very much there, but alongside it was also magic and a sense of verticality. There were 6 classes and each of them had their own unique set of abilities. Although Chivalry had their own unique classes, here it was clearly geared more towards forming synergy between the team rather than just picking what you vibed with the most. Team objective was smaller scale to support this, and it doesn't take a genius to see where the Overwatch comparisons came from. The mix of magic and melee added many possibilities when it came to combat. It was a cool concept, but one that naturally struggled against a more familiar format. If you're looking for a competitive game to get into, is it easier to jump into an FPS that you already understand, or jump into a game with a very different combat system to what you're used to? The only people who already understood the melee combat system side of things were the Chivalry players, but this to many, including myself, was an unexpected surprise. It seemed like a fun game to play, and those who found their place with it enjoyed the ride. It was just something a bit too different to its own benefit and to the dismay of those who again just wanted Chivalry too. I'd never wish for hard work to go down the drain, but unfortunately for this, it really did. From announcement in March 2016 to its release in May 2017 and ultimately its removal from Steam in May 2018, it was a surprisingly quick and quite consistent run. Part of the reason for its removal comes down to the GDPR compliancy issue. I'm not going to turn this into a GDPR lesson, but it stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It's an EU law with mandatory rules for how organizations and companies must use personal data in an integrity-friendly way. Basically, if you weren't GDPR compliant by the time this regulation came into effect, you were about to get EU'd. According to this, they ran out of options for keeping Mirage alive, and the hard truth is that it wasn't a successful game. The player count struggled. The sales were low, and even with a free weekend, it couldn't sustain much popularity. It'll come up again later, but by this point, they were already working on Chivalry 2 and had secured funding from Epic Games. This wasn't just a loss of product, but also a loss of time, as they had to act fast because competition in the medieval combat space was closing in fast. To many people, Mordhau was basically Chivalry 2, updated graphics, refined mechanics, and even more slapstick. What went wrong with Mordhau is unfortunately a similar story in an arguably more frustrating way, and there's a reason why you'll see this image floating around every now and then. What makes Mordhau interesting is that it was the natural evolution of this type of game. It was made primarily by Chivalry fans from the competitive scene, and with that came an acceptance and appreciation for the complexity behind the combat system. Marco Grigorovich was the pioneer behind this, and you'd be mistaken in thinking that he was some kind of full-time dev just giving this a shot. Apparently, he wasn't, and most of the team lacked any real background in development prior to this. A lot of this was driven by the love for Chivalry medieval warfare, but also in spite of it. There was this aspiration and desire to fix what didn't work and bring the genre forward. Even when this was just a simple Unity proof of concept, people could already see that it had great potential. During 2015, it was remade on Unreal Engine 4 and renamed to Mordhau, with their first devlog posted on YouTube in December that year. The group behind it fell under the banner of Triturnion, and now things started to look real.
And they say Chivalry's dead!
As we already know, Chivalry had its issues with readability thanks to the inherent jank that comes with dragging attacks and, by extension, the ability to exploit. So naturally, the key focus with Mordhau was to improve readability, keep fights more face-to-face, and maintain a greater sense of fluidity as well as legitimacy. Just like in Chivalry, you can stab, swing, and overhead. You can also feint, parry, and kick. But instead of just copying Chivalry's combat system and calling it a day, they built upon it. Firstly, you can angle where the attack comes from depending on where you aim. You can also morph attacks, which is basically changing the initial attack to another within its wind-up. If you were to attack immediately after a successful parry, you'll perform a riposte. Instead of just parrying, you can also mirror your opponent's attack to chamber through and change the initiative. It's a higher skilled move, but adds more flavor to combat with zero cost to your stamina. This game is called Mordhau for a reason. The ability to change how you hold your weapon was a unique selling point that brought more to the table than just hold sword by the handle. A sharp blade may be better against lighter armor, but the Mordhau grip, where you hold the blade, provides a great blunt force alternative against heavier armor. Customizability was a big draw for many people. The concept of this game is that you play as a hired mercenary. You're then paid gold based on your performance and attendance. Gold that can be spent on a store full of many weapons, armor, and equipment. Instead of fixed classes, you make your own. You're given a set amount of loadout points, and each item or perk costs a certain amount. This, in a nutshell, provided a lot of freedom, but also allowed for some balance. If you want to run around in heavy armor to tank more hits, but also want to swing along halberds, nice, but you're slower, have no perks, band-aids, or throwables. If you want to be a half-naked man, go for it. You're now faster, you can hold more stuff, even more perks, but you better be good at the game, because... yeah. The game was great at marketing itself. It looked fun, you had the freedom to mess about, and who wouldn't want to give the funny medieval game a go after seeing that you can gain immunity as a bard? What Mordhau had to offer was very good, and if evidence was ever needed for how much hype this game had, the Kickstarter sitting at around $300,000 with one God Emperor supporter is definitely an example. This Kickstarter was from March 2017. They broke well past their goal and managed to hit their stretch goal of competitive matchmaking for 1v1 and 3v3 duels. The whole point of this was to simply work full-time on the project and deliver something more polished. When the game finally released on the 29th of April 2019, they weren't quite prepared for the turnout. With over 60,000 players, a peak they'll never reach again, they had to ask their provider for all available servers. And with that, learned very quickly that fixing issues under pressure whilst also maintaining customer service isn't easy. The general reception of the game was good. If people didn't already love it for the brutal combat, they loved it for the comedy. And content around it was, as you can see, pure gold. Yes, there were noob lobbies, and Chivalry pros did have the edge, but everyone was still figuring things out together. It was a fairly equal playing field. Until, of course, it wasn't. There are a few overarching things that contribute to the fall of Mordhau: accessibility, content, and apathy. If you've seen any the state of or what happened to style of videos for Mordhau, accessibility comes up every time. It's an issue that every person I've had the privilege to talk to brought up as well, and it appears to be the main reason why the player count would die quickly after a free weekend or some kind of content update. But if this was made by Chivalry players, and Chivalry clearly struggled with this, then how on earth did Mordhau? Well, one thing to remember is that this game was made by competitive players who still wanted there to be a skill curve to climb, and they developed a combat system that was admittedly built for more intimate fights. A lot of what was advertised were duels, and whenever it was a large skirmish, it seemed kinda clean, but in reality, things get chaotic pretty quick. With a deeper combat system, complexity is difficult to understand in the heat of the moment. Simply put, there's more to learn, more to put into muscle memory, and with the natural optimization of how best to use said combat system, those who got good, got very good by comparison to those just starting out. And as a result, I'd argue that Mordhau's skill gap grew much larger than Chivalry's. But unfortunately, similar to Tornbanner, Triturnion didn't do much if anything to bridge that gap. So as the player count shrank, the density of more dedicated and experienced players intensified. Although still a fun game with many hours well worth playing, this decreased the likelihood of new players sticking around as they found themselves in the deep end, with a mountain to climb and not much in game to help. The onboarding process is a crucial step in building a relationship between the game and a new player. It's a process that provides an understanding between the objectives, mechanics, and systems in place so that said new player can get involved without feeling helpless or confused. While this is done passively and sometimes taken to the extreme, a tutorial is usually the first introduction. Mordhau has a tutorial, it's okay and it serves its purpose, but doesn't go any further than surface level concept. stats. They don't even show you how to actually drag your weapon. The concept is mentioned and shown by the instructor, but that's all the depth you're gonna get. This is such a core concept that you need to learn early on, and I'm looking at this as of today. There's no real training ground or test level to practice well-known moves or anything to actually teach the player how to get to that higher level of skill. There's no visible path to progression. Did you know that this game has a turn cap, that when you attack, your sensitivity, including DPI, doesn't even need to be that high? Because even if you can turn 100 times per second, that doesn't change the speed of your attack. Well, we won't tell you that, and as a result, you may suffer more than those who turn their default sensitivity down because unlike a shooter, it doesn't need to be that high. Did you know that many medium to pro players don't even use anything close to the default keybinds, or bother to angle their attacks using their aim? That there are just some more straight up optimal ways to play? Well, you may assume so, but that's subjective, and we won't recommend any layout options to help you maybe get on the same page or just even try something that may better suit you. No, you can figure that out yourself. These are just some basic things that I learned after trying out some coaching with Stouty, a prominent voice in the community who's been around since Chivalry. In fact, one of the first things we did was just go through my settings, and immediately I noticed that I was playing better than I ever did before. Obviously not that great, 26-0 to a naked man. But it became very clear to me in this moment that it's the game itself that feels like it's hiding information from you. All the training tab has is a 15-minute tutorial, that's it. The rest is on the community to provide guides, and even though they made one of their own, there's no link to it anywhere. As playtimes increase, the gap between introductory and pro gets wider, and Triturnion basically left the bridge building to the community. The content situation on the surface isn't as wild as what happened with Chivalry's crossovers. The main complaint, however, is that there wasn't much new content and what did come out took too long. Sounds like me. But looking into the content development itself reveals a deeper line as to what went wrong. In a nutshell, Triturnion's focus for new content was geared more towards large-scale team objective. And no matter what they released, they never properly addressed the growing skill gap. These games have two types of players: those who just want to jump into a big battle without much to think about, and those who vie for more competitive play. For simplicity's sake, I'll split these two into casual and competitive. Neither is an indication of actual skill or level. We're looking into preference of game modes and how Triturnion managed to alienate one side while trying to accommodate for another. Casual players like myself are attracted to big battles because the pressure for the individual player is spread much thinner. You charge in, maybe get a kill or two, and then a nice view of your hand. It feels like the blame is less on you and more so the chaos of the situation. The intensity is there, you will get outplayed, but you don't have to be a pro to do alright. Most new players find themselves here. It's the big draw and the big selling point. But a problem from the very start was the lack of any skill-based matchmaking. Without it, the skill gap grew pretty quick, considering also that Chivalry veterans were already accustomed to the core combat system. While this applies to everyone, casual players who took a break would come back to a game where the bar to compete was unanimously raised. For new players, it was a deep end, but for anyone coming back to check out new content, it was a game of catch up against those with hours far beyond your reach. It's not that the new content was bad or jumping back in was complete hell. It's just that they simply created content that would appeal more so to new and casual players without also considering the player experience from onboarding to returning. Just to throw it in there, there's no anti-cheat or never was to my knowledge, or DDoS protection, so add that into the mix. Obviously, skill-based matchmaking on its own wouldn't have stopped the gradual decline, but may have helped to keep the game a bit more alive for longer. If it was implemented today, it would just split an already small player base. Competitive players are the type of people who can feel the changing tick rate of the server with every refund caused by the swing of their sword. These are the more involved players within the community who vie for a higher stakes challenge and mastery of the combat system. Dueling and intense smaller scale fights appeal more to this type of player. 1v1 and 3v3 ranked duels are the only game modes to accommodate for this, and unfortunately both were released quite late in development as part of their stretch goal. But that's all there is. It didn't even occur to me that these game modes have their own skill-based matchmaking till watching Dosh Doshington's post-mortem analysis. The game modes themselves are rather dry in the way that it's quite literally just fighting in an open arena. Earning a rank is cool, but minus private servers, that's all the game really offers for the competitive scene. There's no 5v5 hardcore team objective mode where you have to rely on team synergy to, I don't know, secure the bomb. The end game is basically one of two things: achieve a high rank or become a demigod on the battlefield. A demigod that over time must eventually face other demigods while mere mortals count their fingers. So of course, when new large-scale team objective content is released, yes, there'll be new players, especially if there's a sale, but obviously everyone else is going to join in to check it out, including those from the competitive scene, because what else is there new to do? Some new players may stick around, however, most will leave after realizing that getting to a similar level of skill just to have a chance requires a lot more effort than they initially expected. You can say get good all you want, but the truth is that most people can't be asked, at least to that degree. In a comment by the CEO posted not too long after the game's release, it's confessed that this was basically a game built for slower, smaller scale fights rather than larger, chaotic battles. But they switched focus to larger scale and caused an identity crisis. Even though they understood this, there was never a change in this direction, as I guess it seemed like the hole was already dug too deep. So yeah, basically a game made by competitive players for smaller scale skirmishes that was scaled up and ultimately attracted an audience that they didn't accommodate for, while also not really accommodating for the audience that stuck around. The most recent content update is Demon Horde, a co-op zombies-like experience which on its own is actually pretty fun. This has always been considered a PvP first game with PvE options, and as cool as this is, you can't help but feel that it's a contingency plan for when the player count finally hits the floor. If demand for something isn't met, then the community can step in to provide mods. But that requires modding support that didn't arrive till over 2.5 years after launch. While it wasn't impossible to make mods without this support, a healthy modding community is quite difficult to establish well after its prime. What I heard from people deeper in this side of the community is that when modding support actually arrived, it ironically broke compatibility with existing mods, making it less so support and more like a pain in the arse. It's also worth mentioning that the in-game mod downloader, which is basically the only way you can download mods, is very slow regardless of how fast your internet speed is. So not only did this not help the community, but also left a lot of people sitting there waiting for their favorite servers to be fixed, only to wait longer to re-download the mods. Due to how slow it was, mods had to be limited in scope to reduce size, only adding further limitations. The whole purpose of modding is to give the community an opportunity to bring to life ideas that would otherwise never be tried by development. Yet here, it just wasn't great. The issues with accessibility, the identity crisis that ignored the player experience, and the reluctance to bridge the skill gap pretty much explains why the player count never saw growth. But it's also worth considering the topic of toxicity. Outside of the odd shit talk, it's a fact of life that PvP games can foster toxicity that can go too far. There are levels to it, and it's always subjective as to how much each level impacts a player. Some people care a lot, some people don't, and some people thrive on it. With melee slashers being such a visceral face-to-face experience where you can see your ass getting handed to you, where egos are formed and challenged, most will agree that there needs to be some barriers set in place. Focusing on just the in-game experience here, Triternion didn't account for much. For a good while, there are no basic filters for chat, still no options in-game to report, and some server names... yeah. Games can earn reputations, and regardless of opinion, that can have an impact on the customer's decision, whether it be before or after a purchase. Triternion as a small team only made it harder for themselves by not preparing for this, whether it be by design, naivety, or a lack of foresight. If you saw anything about Mordhau back in the day, then you've probably seen this montage of Giru turning what was meant to be a serious tournament into pure content, running around with a pan and winning fights with a training sword. It was funny as hell and brought so many new eyes to the game. Along with other examples, it promoted it for what it was. A game where you can get so good that you can mess about with money on the line and win by throwing rocks. But it wasn't taken that way by Triternion. There was this sour taste towards the idea of potentially supporting that behavior. There was the opportunity to capitalize, generate further exposure through content made about it, but they decided not to take that opportunity or invest further into the competitive scene, leaving another thing for the community to carry. Crush is a prominent name you'll see thrown around. He was one of the developers, and one could say that he was a red-blooded Chivalry player.
What's worth? Is it worth 100 players leaving, but 100 players buying the game.
I think you should eat some broccolis to raise your testosterone.
Okay, honestly though, are you gonna answer the question? Do you think 100 new players is better than losing 100?
You sound like the dog in your picture, dude. Why the fuck do you even speak to me?
He played a large part in the balancing side of things, and of course this is going to cause flames whenever something has changed. There would be frequent disagreements, and for better or worse, it would be Crush backing the decisions. There was this sentiment that if he or other developers weren't good with a certain weapon, then it's going to get balanced. And there's a lot of flack towards this dev in particular for multiple reasons. Justified or not, fact or fiction, the truth is that he was eventually the only one facing the crowd. At some point, the other developers went silent, and the only way for the core community to get through to development was via Crush. The impression given was that the other developers switched off and only wanted to focus on their own set-in-stone checklist. Community concerns be damned. There was an arrogance to communication. It felt like they figured everything out and did all that needed to be done. That anything else would be pointless, that this is just how things go. The game gets old, the player base drops, and pros scare away new players whenever content is added. And that's just how it is. In reality, this was a small team of first-time developers releasing their first game, but what makes this story frustrating for some is that Chivalry was the example to go by for what to do and what not to do. However, they only managed to replicate the lack of communication, the alienation, and avoided core issues that drove players away before it was too late to fix them. It's easy to get heated about it, but what Tritonion did well is bring the genre forward by innovating the combat system and inspiring others to take their own path, even though that may be out of frustration for what wasn't done. Mordhau isn't a terrible game, and you can still have a lot of fun with it. Is there a future for it? Nah, probably not. It was a game that started off with a lot of promise, but was ultimately not steered in the best direction. The scale of failure with Mirage was total, and to be honest, without it, Chivalry 2 probably wouldn't have come out the way it did. Because after such a failure, Tornbanner had to reassess themselves, take on the fact that things went really wrong, and that they had to change the way they were doing things. They've always been a fairly small team, and going from mostly modders to on-site developers working on something different came with its own set of challenges. Challenges that had to be faced at some point or another as the company grew. As you already know, development began sometime in 2017. It was then later revealed at E3 in June 2019, with of course reception being mixed, as one could assume with Mordhau's prominence at the time as well as a scarred reputation. It was in October that year when they reflected on what went wrong, and by this point Mordhau was still going strong. One thing that already put quite a few people off was the Epic Store 1-year exclusivity agreement, when the game was set to sit in the Epic Store for about a year before moving out to other platforms like Steam. The word sellout has been used to describe this, but in all fairness, it did seem that Mirage really took its toll. To make something bigger and better than before, they needed investment. In their own words, they decided to go down this route to take things to a whole new level that wouldn't be possible without this partnership. 2020 was the planned year of release, but as you can imagine, development timelines had to shift in order to achieve scope. But thankfully, they managed to release the game on the 8th of June 2021. Not only was it released on PC, but also for multiple consoles, each supporting crossplay. And with that came a much wider net that apparently captured 250,000 players within the first hour. Content creation followed the usual procedure, as a lot of big name creators jumped on it for about a week or so, and largely speaking, this game was a big success for what it was. It introduced a lot of new people to the PvP melee slasher scene that have enjoyed the ride regardless of quite a few bumps. Minus some resentment from the past, heated opinions towards the direction of the game, the way certain things were handled, and community drama that can spark the creation of a 4-hour-long video essay, the game did pretty good. And now it's sitting on retirement support waiting for a nightmare to pass. There's one thing in particular that Chivalry 2 did quite well, and it's how it lowered the bar to entry. The tutorial will take you through everything you need to know, showing you a video example before getting you to perform the action yourself. You're actually shown how to drag your weapon and why it's important, first on clearly defined targets, then on a test subject. You can see that they wanted you to get the idea in your head. They show you the simple but easy to forget concept of timing your strike while running towards the enemy. Similar to Mordhau, they have counters, which are basically easier chambers where you hold block and quickly respond with the same attack. And yeah, you heard that right. Instead of a timed parry, you can just hold up your weapon to block at the cost of stamina. This this on its own is a much more simple concept to grasp, especially for new players, that can still be punished by pros. Again, similar to Mordhau, you can riposte by blocking and attacking straight after. With the consideration of large battles and the likelihood of being outnumbered, a successful riposte can deflect incoming attacks, increasing your survivability and providing the sense that you've got a chance. Overall, I'd say that the Chivalry 2 combat system brings the bar to entry much lower, and that was clearly the aim, because the market is there, but the tricky part is getting people to feel comfortable enough to stay. After the tutorial, you pick your faction and then are thrown into battle against some bots. With this, immediately the player can try out what they've just learned against AI that won't try any advanced techniques. Fighting against bots isn't anything new, neither are offline games, but of course the push makes the difference. There was also more of a push to increase the pace of battle. For example, when you respawn, you're already charging in the direction of the objective. The game is actively leading you to where you need to go. Not to mention that you may join a battle that's just about to start, and from the very beginning are faced with the opponent. Instead of waiting to try and find the enemy, you've got these intro cinematics that kick the game off, which are pretty cool, even if that means you're a simple farmer learning very quickly what an invasion looks like. To keep players in the fight for longer, there's the chance that you can get downed and picked back up again. Visual indicators for successful actions are more visible, and in the heat of combat, that can help. To be fair, it does give a bit more of an arcadey feel to it, but all in all, this is a much easier game to get into for people who are new to this genre. A lower bar to entry doesn't mean that there's no skill curve. There is a competitive scene, there are exploits, and pro players can easily dominate the field. It's just that the skill curve is less steep to start with. Although with all that being said, it is worth mentioning that this game didn't have skill-based matchmaking till much later, and when it did come out, it somehow managed to do the opposite. But overall, they did do better in the accessibility and onboarding department. So then, what actually went wrong with Chivalry 2? Well, to be honest, for the casual player, not too much. But if you zoom in, things get a bit disappointing, and clearly, some old habits die hard. First off, as a small reminder, Tornbanner was still a small team when they started working on Chivalry 2. And as a small team, we can't build that forever game, Lofstrom says in an interview with Rock Paper Shotgun. The intention was never to make something that lasted longer than 3 years, and it's hard not to accept that a large part of what makes these games pop are the first few months when everyone's still a bit fresh before moving on to the next big thing. When it comes to the content side of things, we know that it brings people back, but it also maintains some sort of engagement. To be fair, Chivalry 2 received more new content throughout the years than what was ever delivered in-house with Chivalry 1. And it wasn't until the 22nd of May 2024 when content development ended. The more you look into the content delivered, the more you can see that they clearly had a defined roadmap that they did achieve, just not at the pace that most would have liked, with actual new content being rather spread out. If a month doesn't feel long to you, then you're old, but playing the same game mode on the same few maps without anything new for a while can take its toll. What can also take its toll are the inherent issues that come with a game that appears to have been rushed in certain areas. Large-scale battles, as we already know, are a big draw to games like this, and Chivalry 2 went hard on the 64-player servers. Thankfully, with a more resilient generation of consoles, cross-platform is also possible to this scale. But regardless of hardware, networking issues plagued launch. Desync became a topic of discussion, and matchmaking was a bit broken. As for example, the party system that was meant to let you matchmake with your friends just didn't work for a good while, which as you can imagine isn't too great on launch, as initial hype only lasts for about a week or so. When it comes to build quality, updates would come with their own set of new bugs, some I've heard coming back from the grave. This wouldn't have been much of an issue if things were fixed in a more timely manner. The fact that this game is cross-platform is great, however, to push an update requires attention across all of them. So as you can imagine, this causes delays, and unfortunately the delays themselves would often be vaguely communicated. Cheating and hacking is basically a force of nature, one that requires constant defense. Like when you have to mow the spiky green stuff, because it keeps coming back. Chivalry 2 does have anti-cheat, and with that it does require a bit more effort to hack. Maybe money for those more set up on the idea. Apparently North America didn't seem to suffer as much as Europe when it came to hacking and cheating, but it did get pretty bad. Flying about and speed killing the whole server in team objective is annoying for the odd player, but when it comes to the more communal areas, things get a little advanced. On many occasions, hackers would actively join duel yards with the goal just to piss people off. And naturally, they'd get vote kicked. But then things evolved to a point where, if they were kicked, the server would simply crash. And those who voted to kick would be identified and added to a list for the hacker to follow across any available server. It's one of those damned if you don't or damned if you do type situations. And the more prominent the issue becomes, the more effort it is for the average player to stick around. What made things worse is that when the game came out for Game Pass, anti-cheat just wasn't there. With Game Pass being on PC, you can see where this is going. Easy burner accounts and even easier hacks. Now, Tornbanner did give certain people admin permissions to help moderate, and when an issue like this occurs, part of the banning process is to find the user ID of the hacker, but that's tough to do when the hackers learn how to hide it. It also didn't help that people knew that Tornbanner knew who some of the repeat offenders were, yet never went further than an account ban. If you really wanted to, you could just set up a new account, keep your main account safe, and do a little griefing. And to only make matters worse, Tornbanner for whatever reason didn't add private hosting till much later. Which is honestly insane to think about. Being able to host a private server was a big part of Chivalry 1 and Mordhau. The ability to host a private server for public use basically comes with its own moderation. If there's a portion of the community who just want to jump into a duel yard, then having the ability to lock it off with a passcode only to allow those people who aren't going to hack in, the hackers themselves can't actually get in to cause any trouble. But here's the thing, when they did introduce private servers, it was via their own partnered channel, and that was supposed to have some kind of protection in place, but ultimately it didn't. So imagine spending that much money with no other option while not only being at the mercy of hackers, but also the odd DDoS campaign. They did eventually add some kind of security, but you can imagine the disappointment from those who just wanted to host a server back when the service came out. The 4-hour-long video essay I mentioned earlier by LaRubric goes into more detail about the hacking issue, but ultimately it was a problem that never really saw much resolve. This was never planned to be a forever game, but that doesn't mean that there won't be a forever audience. It's those who stick around who buy the DLC, support the game further, and are probably the only ones who are going to complete the battle passes. They have those in this game as well. It's a common thread now that the more committed fan base take the backseat. While Mordhau wasn't great in this, at least there was more transparency and freedom to go your own way, even if modding support didn't come out till far too late. In fact, on a side tangent, Chivalry 2 has no mod support, just none, which is a massive shame, especially considering where Tornbanner came from. If it wasn't for Half-Life 2 and the ability to make Age of Chivalry, then where would they be today? But similar to Mordhau, most content went towards large-scale team objective, and it was clearly built for that from the start. The main selling point was always the big cinematic battles. However, it's natural by this point that there's a casual side to the player base and a more community-driven, competitive side. And it's when you look into that side, the competitive and social aspect to the game, where you begin to see frustration caused by old habits and new. I've mentioned them before, but duel yards are something well worth talking about now. The concept of a duel yard is highly social and basically tradition by this point. The idea is simple. You join, you find an opponent, flourish or do some freaky bowing, and then you have yourself a 1v1. Similar to something like a Dark Souls fight club, there's this etiquette with unwritten rules that form between more involved players. Of course, in these games specifically, there's chat and some servers have clear rules. Breaking said rules or disturbing the peace would basically get you kicked, banned, or focused by the whole server. To accommodate for dueling in Chivalry 2, you basically have two options: unranked matchmaking or the more preferred duel yards, which as you'll soon see were clearly not something properly considered within scope. Before private hosting, Chivalry 2 did have public duel yards with one simple rule only found within the name of the server. 1v1 only, flourish at opponent to initiate. And that's it. No rules pop up in game, no unique mechanic to initiate, nothing to stop you from running in and going nuts. I mean, if someone's griefing, it's usually them versus the whole server, and it's not that much of an issue when you can just vote to kick or report, even though the reporting process does require video evidence and probably won't resolve until long after the event. But a large part to sustaining etiquette within these servers came down to simply telling people in chat. Understandably, some players may just have no idea what they're doing and need to be told. It was very much community driven in that way, and this is where things get kind of funny, if not quite annoying, because it was a bit of a disaster when cross-platform came to these servers. You see, the only way you could access duel yards was on PC, because console players didn't have access to the server list and were stuck in standard matchmaking, until of course they eventually allowed console players to access the server list, which is a good thing. However, there was a bit of an issue with that, because console players don't have access to chat. So as you can imagine, with a lot of players who aren't familiar with duel servers in the first place, that can cause a bit of confusion. At one point, the game came to PlayStation Plus, and as if the universe itself was having a laugh, a bug came with it that essentially broke the vote to kick system. Think about it, a small percentage of PlayStation Plus players is still a lot. And without chat or vote to kick, it was apparently a difficult week for duelists. Now, private hosting didn't come till the Feta for All update in March 2024, about 2 years and 9 months since launch. And this update in particular is quite an interesting turning point for the community side of things. This was basically a handover from Tornbanner to the community to moderate duels and foot the cost. Because if there was ever a problem on these servers, it would have to be sorted out by staff that was apparently quite short supply. With this update came the removal of duel yards or duel servers for what are now social servers, without any flourish to 1v1 rules. Because social servers don't come with this rule, there's no real need to moderate for anything outside of hacking. They're basically just free-for-all matches to, I guess, socialize in. It was basically the death of official duel yards, and the new private hosting service that came with this update looked like a way to cash in on those who wanted to keep that part of the culture going. Additionally, in an ironic way, 3 maps were released with this update, and one of those is called Duel Yard. It's a really cool map with all kinds of things to mess about with, but what would have been cool is to see this come out earlier when public duel yards were still a thing. And you may think to yourself, well, fair enough, it takes time to make new content and maybe this was just poor timing. Well, here's the thing, this map is the same map from the tutorial, the exact same map. When it comes to the community and more competitive side of things, tournaments were mostly community driven, and Tornbanner have helped by providing private servers. They have been known to fund some events, and if you're lucky, you can win a peasant hat. When it comes to tournaments specifically, there are a few rabbit holes, but this was never meant to be an esport. However, the drive is there, because as you can see with each game, there's always a competitive scene, and the main reason for even covering that side of the audience is because they are the forever audience, and they are the ones who expose the core issues. One core issue in particular that has burnt quite a few bridges is Tornbanner's new approach to communication. The best way to describe Tornbanner's approach to communication, based on what I've seen and heard, is corporate, rather signed off and a bit too curated. It's not like they didn't try to keep people in the loop about major delays or never patched anything, but it seemed like unless the issue was absolutely game-breaking, there wouldn't be much reassurance as to if it would be resolved. I mean, the hacking situation comes up here again because it got pretty bad and was a prominent issue for the core community for a long time. But there was no word from Tornbanner till much later, saying that it's in no uncertain terms that addressing cheaters is their top priority. Now, I'm well aware that this is going to sound very trust me bro, but I've had the privilege to chat with a few people that have been a part of the community who prefer not to be in this video. And based on those conversations, the best way to describe what it was like trying to get Tornbanner to listen was like throwing notes into the void, not quite knowing what will come back. I mean, people wanted private servers for a long time, and then all of a sudden, when it suits them best, they come out with something. It's easy to say developers and forget that they are people with schedules, deadlines, and pressure from above to execute company-approved high-priority tasks. But it seemed like not much else besides the next big thing was important enough to address. Unless of course it was critical. If you look at the slowed pace of updates and the increase in staff, one could assume that there's something else being worked on, something big that is drawing attention away from development. On the 22nd of May 2024, the Regicide update concluded Chivalry 2, marking the official end for content development. And of course, the question on everyone's mind was what's next? Could it be that they were working on Chivalry 3rd, the Arcane Warfare remaster? Well, No, because of course, this is where that damned quote, that unintentional prophecy, becomes reality. On the 10th of June 2024, No More Room in Hell 2 was announced. And the short story is, it didn't go too well. This is what went wrong with No More Room in Hell 2, so far, the light version. And I'm being a man of my word, stuck on a bus. Interestingly enough, No More Room in Hell 2 shares a similar origin to Chivalry, as it started from a Half-Life 2 mod. One that came out in 2011 and became a free standalone in 2013. A standalone that currently shares a similar player count with the sequel. The general concept that applies to both is zombie survival in the more traditional sense. Each zombie is a legitimate threat that is best avoided. There's always a chance that you'll contract the virus on contact, and when you do, it's a race against time to find the cure or become another threat. There may be the odd runner, but most are slow and they are many. You have limited resources and have to use them wisely. Both the 8-player co-op and working together is crucial for survival because once you're gone, and the rest must survive without you. It's meant to be a hardcore experience with a heavier lean towards realism and less reliance on UI. The mod is claustrophobic by nature with semi-dynamic environments, and by contrast the sequel is more open world with objectives leading to the center, where the goal is to perform said objectives before safely extracting. A successful extraction means you can keep your randomly generated character and level them up. Losing them is permanent. Lever Games were the original developers, and with limited resources, they were in the process of creating the sequel before the Torn Banner acquisition. Of course, when you think about it with Chivalry 2, things seem to slow down a little bit, or it seemed like their attention was elsewhere, and with the announcement of this, it adds some context as to maybe why. In October 2022, Lever Games mentioned a partnership with a larger studio. They then confirmed in March 2023 that the game had entered full-time development, suggesting that Torn Banner's involvement may have begun in late 2022 or early 2023. There's a post on this with a longer timeline of the development journey itself as well as more commentary, but in relation to Torn Banner specifically, it's clear that they were at least juggling two things for a good portion of Chivalry 2's roadmap. This information could mean nothing, it could be completely pointless to throw in, but I feel like it gives some context as to why things may have been a bit slow for Chivalry 2, because they already knew when Chivalry 2 was going to end, and this was the new big thing. What went wrong so far with the sequel is a combination of a couple things, one of which being the launch in October 2024, that was quite damaging to its reputation. This is an early access game, and some will use early access as a shield against criticism, but $30 from an experienced studio is asking a lot for how unstable it was. Terrible desync, floating heads, and teleporting zombies are just a few of the issues encountered. Even to this day, some fly and others strike a pose. The harsh reality of early access is that it's still a launch regardless. The initial hype is something hard to get back, and it didn't fill many people with hope. Most won't buy the game till they see significant progress. When you expose the core concept to the world, it will be criticized, and that has a direct impact on sales. Unfortunately, not long after launch there were some layoffs, as they had to make the difficult decision to undergo a restructure because as a fully independent, self-funded developer, they were up against many challenges. Apparently those who were let go received severance packages as well as being able to keep their work computers, but it's hard not to draw a correlation here and see that this may be a sign that things weren't going too smooth with Torn Banner and they had to adjust to a new financial reality. The second thing is expectations. Taking over an IP with a following full of nostalgia and love for the original is a very risky move, let alone making a sequel to something that already hit the spot. There were of course some reservations about Torn Banner's acquisition of the IP. Will they treat it with care? Will it be done right? Will it be true to the original? While the overall concept wasn't too far from the mod or what was to be expected for the sequel, there were some things missed and elements that weren't present. For example, the infection mechanic was special in the way that you'd basically have to survive on pills till you find a cure, and if you didn't, it would be best to take one for the team. In the sequel, the depth to it just wasn't there, but now thankfully it is. After playing both the mod and sequel for equal amounts of time, the levels within the mod provide a much more slow and methodical journey. Due to the confined spaces and limited paths, you have to think on your feet because running out of stamina could mean the end very fast. It genuinely felt like there was more purpose to it. Your decisions carry weight and so do your mistakes. At the end, I had a story to tell. and so did everyone else who took part. In the sequel, that element lingers, but nowhere near as strong with random people. The gameplay loop lacks a deeper meaning to it. It's hard to describe, but the coordination between other survivors is less required here. You'll often find people rushing objectives, as with the current spawn points for zombies, it's more so a race against time than a push through a crowd. It's also worth mentioning that the melee combat is nothing like Chivalry, and it shouldn't be. It replicates the original, it's still satisfying, but there's something to it that feels a bit disconnected. Maybe it's the weird range. Thankfully, playing the game today is a different story in the way that it's much more stable. When you play it, you can see potential. And the good news is, at least looking at it now, is that Tornbanner seems committed to making it better. It has a long way to go, they have a roadmap, and they appear to be listening to community feedback, which admittedly might be hard to hear for some Chivalry veterans. However, one cannot deny that they've put their eggs into a rather shaky basket. Will there ever be a Chivalry 3? Most likely, but it's hard to tell when or how it will turn out if the studio struggles to push forwards. For now, when it comes to melee slashers, the ball is well and truly in another court. So then, what now? Is this the end of the medieval melee slasher? No, of course not. In fact, I think things are about to get interesting. Regardless of development decisions, there's a natural evolution that comes with any genre. Mordhau was made in spite of Chivalry's unpolished combat system, a combat system that, looking back at it now, was fundamentally flawed and would require a complete rework. Mordhau just turned out to be that rework. Chivalry 2 then took a couple leaves out of Mordhau's book with a combat system and proved that you can lower the bar to entry and still have a fun game with a skill curve to climb. Inspiration is what takes a genre forwards, and forwards is never a straight path, neither should it be. It's the frustration of problems not being solved, things not being explored that push people to go their own way and get creative. And that's where we're at now. Giru, the guy who threw rocks and surfed around in the Twitch Rivals tournament, recently dropped a trailer for Ad Mortem, a dark fantasy PvP and co-op game with scaled down fights to focus more on team synergy. As clearly learned from past experience, skill-based matchmaking on top of an easy to pick up combat system is a priority according to what's on the store page. There's Renown, which I personally want to say is the spiritual successor to Reign of Kings, but jokes aside, this game brings the slasher style combat system to the survival setting. It's a step in a different direction and one that seems to fit well. Survival games can be hit or miss, but have great potential to be that forever game where hard of hearing Aussies and Danish people lurk. Fiefdom is another that revealed itself fairly recently, where the focus is on large-scale battles both by land and sea in this dynamic world. It's a melee slasher by definition, but also includes magic within combat. It's not to the same degree as Mirage, but there is a bit more of a dueling aspect to it. What I'm trying to show here is that this genre is growing. It's those who love the raw nature of the combat system from the games before who are taking it in different directions. It's point blank obvious, but what went wrong in this genre largely came down to development and the poor decisions that followed. More specifically, the inability or inaction to tackle the new challenges unique to games like this. But what went right was also because of the people behind it. There's no telling if any of these projects will succeed. It's guaranteed, however, that each will face challenges that the team behind it may not even be able to resolve because of some unforeseen issues baked into the code. That to fix would essentially mean dismantling the whole thing or spending resources that just aren't there anymore. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned first-person shooters. And if you look at the history of that genre, with the amount of games, the different paths it took, and the evolution as well as the devolution, you can see a long history of mistakes to learn from. It's a part of the process to build upon what came before. And the reality here is that innovation in this space for the longest of time has been slow. But it's nice to stand here to see that the genre you grew up with has some kind of future. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a wicked time, and I'm gonna shamelessly plug the WickedWiz channel here because we've got a big video coming out there soon about some funny dinosaur games. It's quite an interesting dumpster dive to say the least. Of course, a massive thanks to all of my supporters. You guys pay for the snacks at the station. Also, thank you to all of those who have given their time to chat about and provide context for the games covered in this video. And finally, a personal shout out to all of my based wizards. Gibbles by the dozen, the Cuddly Bop, Negadan, the one with severed toes, Abby, the Meatly, Durham Trollfist, Matt MC, Pete Z, Spooky, King Delirious, Bob the Bronto, Scotched Eggs, Big Ram, Grimber, LetterOpener.mp3, Julie, Ambassador Ass, Dante's Face, The Smiley, Roland Deshane, and I Don't Fit Through Doorways. I'll see you guys in the next one where I may be in space or sneaking around somebody's house.